A quiet signal from Mar-a-Lago this week sent shockwaves through European capitals and raised questions that NATO allies hoped they would never have to ask about American leadership. According to multiple diplomatic sources, what appeared to be an offhand comment about reconsidering Russia sanctions has triggered what one senior European official described as the most urgent consultations since the 2022 invasion began. To understand why a few sentences from Florida could destabilize alliance structures that have held for decades, you have to look beyond the immediate headlines and examine the intricate web of economic warfare that has become the backbone of Western response to Russian aggression. The sanctions regime isn't just a policy tool, it's become the defining test of transatlantic unity, and any crack in that foundation threatens to bring down the entire structure. When we talk about Russia sanctions, we're not discussing abstract diplomatic gestures. We're examining a comprehensive economic siege that has fundamentally altered global financial flows, energy markets, and supply chains. The sanctions apparatus, built methodically over nearly 3 years, represents the largest coordinated economic pressure campaign in modern history. It involves asset freezes worth hundreds of billions of dollars, technology transfer restrictions that have crippled entire Russian industries, and banking exclusions that have essentially severed Russia from the international financial system. The European response to reported signals from Trump's orbit reveals just how dependent this entire architecture has become on American enforcement mechanisms. European officials understand that U.S. financial institutions serve as the enforcement backbone of the global sanctions regime. When American banks refuse to process transactions, when U.S. technology companies cut off access, when American energy firms halt operations, the impact reverberates globally in ways that European-only sanctions never could. What makes this moment particularly precarious is the economic reality that European nations have absorbed significant costs to maintain sanctions unity. German industrial output has suffered from lost Russian energy supplies. Italian luxury goods manufacturers have lost access to wealthy Russian consumers. French agricultural exports have been redirected at considerable logistical expense. These sacrifices were bearable only under the assumption that American leadership would remain constant and that the economic pressure would eventually force a Russian strategic recalculation. Intelligence analysts across European capitals are now modeling scenarios that seemed impossible just months ago. What happens to energy prices if Russian oil sanctions are lifted unilaterally by the United States? How do European companies compete if American firms are suddenly free to resume business with Russian partners? These aren't theoretical exercises anymore. They're urgent strategic planning sessions driven by the recognition that Trump's approach to sanctions could fundamentally alter the global economic landscape. The technical mechanics of sanctions relief reveal why European panic is justified. Many of the most effective restrictions rely on what experts call secondary sanctions, penalties imposed on third-party companies that continue doing business with sanctioned entities. These secondary sanctions work primarily because they threaten access to U.S. markets and the dollar-denominated financial system. If an incoming administration signals willingness to waive these secondary penalties, European companies face an impossible choice: maintain solidarity with European policy or regain access to lucrative Russian markets. Financial markets are already beginning to price in this uncertainty. Currency traders are watching the ruble's strength against European currencies as investors speculate about potential sanctions relief. Commodity markets are experiencing volatility as energy companies attempt to position themselves for possible policy reversals. The mere possibility of sanctions modification is creating market dynamics that undermine the economic pressure that sanctions were designed to create. What European officials find most alarming is the speed with which sanctions relief could be implemented. Unlike the careful coordination required to build the sanctions regime, dismantling key components could happen through executive action within days of a new administration taking office. Treasury Department officials could issue new general licenses, modify existing restrictions, or simply decline to enforce certain penalties. The asymmetry between construction and destruction of economic pressure campaigns means that years of careful alliance coordination could be undone with a few policy memoranda. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond economics. European intelligence services have invested enormous resources in monitoring sanctions evasion networks, tracking illicit financial flows, and coordinating with American counterparts to close loopholes. This cooperation has generated valuable intelligence about Russian state capabilities, revealed corruption networks within Russian leadership, and provided insights into Moscow's strategic vulnerabilities. If sanctions relief removes the imperative for this intelligence sharing, European services lose a critical window into Russian decision-making processes. Military analysts are particularly concerned about technology transfer restrictions. Current sanctions have significantly hampered Russian access to advanced semiconductors, precision machinery, and dual-use technologies that enhance military capabilities. European defense officials worry that premature sanctions relief could allow Russia to rebuild its defense industrial base more rapidly than anticipated, potentially shifting military balances in ways that require costly European countermeasures. The timing of these signals creates additional complications for European strategic planning. Energy contracts, defense procurement decisions, and infrastructure investments are typically planned years in advance. The uncertainty about American sanctions policy makes long-term European energy security planning nearly impossible. How do you negotiate alternative energy supplies when you don't know whether existing restrictions on Russian energy will remain in place? European diplomatic efforts are now focused on what sources describe as damage limitation. Foreign ministries are exploring mechanisms to maintain effective economic pressure on Russia, even if American participation diminishes. This involves complex legal frameworks, alternative financial institutions, and coordination mechanisms that don't depend on U.S. enforcement. However, experts widely acknowledge that such European-only alternatives would be significantly less effective than the current comprehensive approach. The domestic political implications within European countries are equally significant. Many European leaders have expended considerable political capital justifying economic sacrifices to their publics as necessary for transatlantic solidarity and Ukrainian support. If American policy shifts fundamentally, these leaders face the difficult task of explaining why their citizens should continue bearing economic costs that Americans are no longer willing to share. Public opinion polling across Europe reveals growing concern about this possibility. Citizens who supported sanctions as part of a unified Western response expressed less enthusiasm for maintaining economic pressure if it appears that the United States is abandoning the effort. This creates domestic political pressure on European leaders to reconsider their own sanctions policies, potentially accelerating the collapse of the coordinated approach. The legal complexities of sanctions modification also create headaches for European governments. Many current restrictions are embedded in international agreements, UN resolutions, and bilateral treaties that cannot be easily modified. If American policy changes make these legal frameworks obsolete, European governments may need to navigate complex parliamentary processes to adjust their own laws, creating months or years of legal uncertainty. What makes this situation particularly challenging for European policymakers is the lack of clear signals about American intentions. Diplomatic sources describe a frustrating environment where European officials are preparing for multiple scenarios without clear guidance about which is most likely. This uncertainty paralyzes decision-making and forces European governments to hedge their bets in ways that may ultimately undermine their own strategic objectives. The broader question that emerges from this analysis concerns the durability of alliance-based economic strategies. If sanctions regimes can be dismantled by single-country policy changes, how effective are they as long-term strategic tools? European strategists are grappling with the recognition that their approach to economic statecraft may need fundamental restructuring to account for American policy volatility. Intelligence assessments suggest that Russian officials are closely monitoring these developments and may be adjusting their own strategic calculations based on perceived American policy shifts. If Moscow believes that sanctions pressure will diminish significantly, it may become less willing to engage in diplomatic solutions to the Ukraine conflict, potentially prolonging military operations that European nations are struggling to support indefinitely. The implications for future crisis management are equally concerning. If the current sanctions regime collapses due to American policy changes, European officials worry about the precedent this sets for responses to future acts of aggression. Will economic pressure campaigns remain viable tools of statecraft if they can be undermined by changes in American domestic politics? As we watch this situation develop, the fundamental question becomes whether transatlantic economic coordination can survive the kind of policy reversals that seem increasingly possible. European capitals are preparing for a future where their economic security may depend less on American alliance commitments and more on their own independent capabilities. Whether such independence is achievable and at what cost may determine the shape of international relations for the next generation.